Now we're going to begin our look at the Union in crisis. In section 1, we look at how the nation split apart. Our learning objective is to describe the causes of the secession of the southern states. So first, we have to realize that the issue of slavery really did divide the nation. The division between the North and South increased over the issue of slavery during the first half of the 19th century. Soon after the Mexican-American War, the debate over slavery intensified. Of particular concern were the new territories gained from Mexico. So this brings us to the Compromise of 1850, and this helped to settle the dispute temporarily. It was a series of 5 bills that passed Congress. In it, California was admitted as a free state, the slave trade was abolished in the District of Columbia, New Mexico, which is including present-day Arizona and Utah territories, were organized under popular sovereignty, meaning that the people of the territory would determine for themselves whether or not slavery would be allowed. The Fugitive Slave Act was passed, making it a crime to assist runaway slaves. And Texas gave up some of its land to pay its debts. Now, particular concern was the Fugitive Slave Act, probably the most divisive part of this bill, because ultimately it allows Southerners to accuse African Americans in the North of being runaway slaves. And really, there was no way for them to really disprove this, and under this act, they could then be, in effect, taken back to slave territory. And of course, many Northerners as well were abolitionists and wanted to help those African Americans escape from slavery in the South to the North. And now it's now seen as being a crime, something that they don't feel too good about. So this increases tensions tremendously. Another act comes about known as the Kansas-Nebraska Act. This is really put forth by Illinois Senator Stephen Douglas, who supported the idea of popular sovereignty, and he proposed organizing 2 new territories of Kansas and Nebraska. This Kansas-Nebraska Act outraged many Northerners. Many Whigs left the party and joined the Free Soil Party and other anti-slavery parties to form the Republican Party. Violence breaks out. Soon, violence broke out between supporters of slavery and abolitionists. Kansas became especially violent and was dubbed Bleeding Kansas. But violence wasn't limited to the general populace. South Carolina Senator Preston Brooks attacked Massachusetts Senator Charles Sumner on the floor of the Senate and beat him with a cane. Another divisive court decision came with the Dred Scott decision. Dred Scott, a slave, filed a lawsuit claiming that the fact that his owner had taken him to a free state made him a free man. In the Dred Scott versus Sandford decision, the Supreme Court ruled that slaveholders' Fifth Amendment property rights protect the slaveholders' rights even in a free state. And of course, this doesn't set well in the North, because in the North, they see this as really a violation. They don't have slavery in the North, and they're looking at the rights of the African American, and it's already bad in their minds that it is allowed, that slavery is allowed in the South, but now they can bring their slaves into the North and still maintain them or maintain their possession as property. And so once again, this continues to kind of ramp up the disagreements between the North and the South. Then another incident takes place that really begins to create a great deal of fear in the South and a lot of anger in the North. One slave who managed to make it out of slavery actually was able to be freed by his owner, had sought to free the rest of his family. His wife and children were owned by another slaveholder. And so he went to the north and began to work to try to buy the freedom of his family. And he's got this agreed upon price, but when he finally raises the money, partially through contributions made by other abolitionists, he returns to the South, to the slaveholder, to try to purchase the freedom of this slave, of his family, and finds that the price has now increased. And so, really feeling dejected and hopeless, he leaves and goes back home. And on the way, he runs into a man named John Brown. Now, John Brown is an abolitionist, but John Brown is also someone we would classify as a terrorist. Hoping to start a slave revolt, John Brown launched an attack on the U.S. arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia. And this freed slave joins his attack and actually ends up being the first member of John Brown's raiding party to be killed. In his pocket, they find letters from his wife. And so when those letters are circulated in the North, that continues to create more outrage in the North at the institution of slavery. But at the same time, this raid launched by John Brown really failed to spark a slave revolt as he had hoped, and U.S. Marines overtook the arsenal, captured Brown and his surviving followers. He was charged with treason against Virginia, and he was executed. Many Northerners once again viewed him as a hero, but in the South they viewed him as a terrorist, and really largely blamed the North, as many of them were abolitionists, for what happened. Now we're going to look at Lincoln's rise to the presidency. Lincoln was born in Kentucky in 1809 and later moved to Illinois. As a young man, he took a job on a riverboat delivering produce from Indiana to New Orleans. And it was here that he first witnessed a slave auction, and he was appalled by what he saw. In 1834, he was elected to the state legislature of Illinois. In 1846, he was elected to Congress, but he resigned in 1849 to practice law. After the Kansas-Nebraska Act, he decided to return to politics, and he organized the Illinois Republican Party and decided to run against Stephen Douglas for his seat in the Senate. And now we're going to look at the Lincoln-Douglas debates. Lincoln and Douglas engaged in a series of debates, and the debates focused on the Kansas-Nebraska Act and the Dred Scott decision. Lincoln's anti-slavery message gained a national audience, and Douglas lost support in both the North and the South. And this brings us now to the election of 1860. Northern and Southern Democrats split over the issue of running Stephen Douglas. The Northern Democrats ran Douglas, while the Southern Democrats ran John C. Breckinridge. This split in the Democratic Party allowed Lincoln, the Republican nominee, to win the election. Northerners now controlled both houses of Congress, and the Union now had an anti-slavery president. After John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry, Southerners were fearful of a Southern uprising. And while Republicans denounced the raid, many Southerners blamed Republicans because they were opposed to slavery. And the South saw Lincoln's victory as a victory for the abolitionists. South Carolina was the first state to secede. By February of 1861, 6 more Southern states voted to secede. So all in all, you have 7 Southern states that have decided to leave the Union, to leave the United States before Lincoln has even taken office. Modern elections take place in November, early November, and under the modern times, we do the presidential inauguration in January, January 20th to be specific. But at the time, inaugurations didn't take place until March. So Lincoln wins the 1860 election, but before he takes office in March of 1861, 7 states have voted to secede or to leave the United States.